12 ships went silent in the space of 4 seconds, and I watched every second of it happen on the main display of the council chamber. One moment the Kaldrenic border fleet was a tidy row of green markers moving in formation toward a single unarmed vessel. The next moment, 11 markers turned red. Then the 12th. Then nothing. No wreckage. No distress calls. No final transmissions begging for rescue. The ships were simply gone from every sensor that had been tracking them, as if someone had reached into the display and wiped them off with a cloth. I sat very still in my observer's chair, my hands flat on the cold desk in front of me, and I did not breathe for what felt like a long time. Around me, 40 other delegates did the same thing. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The chamber, which usually hummed with the low murmur of 100 private conversations, had gone as quiet as the space where those 12 ships used to be. I want to tell you how we got here, because none of us saw it coming, and because the warning was sitting in a file that nobody bothered to open. 40 cycles earlier, in this same chamber, under these same lights, the Kaldrenic delegation stood up and asked the council to approve a war. I remember thinking it was a small thing, a formality, the kind of vote that happens so often in this chamber, that most of us stop paying real attention to the words and just watch for the hand signals that tell us when to press our approval buttons. The Kaldrenic ambassador, a broad, confident man named Callum Dre, stood at the podium and spoke about a border dispute, about lost cargo convoys, about a species he called by a designation instead of a name. Terran, he said, a minor species, recently discovered, encroaching on Kaldrenic trade lanes near the outer rim. Hostile, uncooperative, and beneath the dignity of formal diplomacy, he requested authorization for a punitive war action, the kind the council approves a dozen times a cycle without much thought, usually against species too small, or too new, to have any representation in this chamber at all. I did not know the word Terran. I looked it up on my personal display while he was still talking, the way I always did when a species I did not recognize came up in session, mostly out of habit rather than real curiosity. The registry entry was 3 lines long. Homeworld, a single planet called Earth, temperate class, oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, technology level, pre-standard, recently transitioned to intersystem travel, council status, unaffiliated, no formal contact established. 3 lines. That was the entire file the council had on a species we were about to declare war on. Someone near the back of the chamber laughed quietly at something, I don't know what, and the sound carried further than it should have in that silence, and a few other delegates smiled the way you smile when you're not really listening but you want to seem friendly. The vote was called. Hands went up around the chamber, almost without thought, mine included, because that was what you did. Because objecting to a vote like this one meant sitting through an hour of procedural arguments nobody wanted to have at the end of a long session. The measure passed by a wide margin. Ambassador Dre thanked the chamber with a short bow and returned to his seat, already talking quietly with an aide about fleet deployment schedules. That was when I noticed the archivist. She was an old woman, one of the record keepers who sat along the side wall and rarely spoke in session, the kind of council fixture you stop seeing after your first few cycles because she never changes and never draws attention to herself. Her name was Grace Whitlow, and in all my time in that chamber, I do not think I had heard her voice more than a handful of times. She stood up. The movement alone was enough to make a few heads turn, because archivists did not stand during session. They observed and recorded, and stayed out of the proceedings entirely. She walked to the small podium reserved for procedural requests, and she asked, in a voice that was steady but not loud, for the vote to be struck from the record and reconsidered. The speaker, a tall man named Owen Fitch, who had run these sessions for longer than I had been alive, looked almost amused. He asked her on what grounds. She said that the council was voting on a species it had not read about. She said the word Earth the way some people say the names of things they are afraid of, carefully, like she did not want to give it any more attention than it had already taken. The speaker denied the request. He said the vote had already passed, that reconsideration wasn't standard procedure for a punitive action against an unaffiliated species, and that if Archivist Whitlow had concerns, she was welcome to submit a formal briefing for a future session. She did not argue. She simply turned and walked out of the chamber, and I remember thinking that was strange, because archivists did not leave mid-session either. I made a note of it in my personal log. The way I noted small oddities out of habit, filed it under nothing in particular, and moved on to the next item of business, which was a tariff dispute between two mining consortiums that took up the rest of the afternoon. I did not think about Earth again for 40 cycles. The border fleet had been dispatched almost immediately after the vote, 12 ships under Caldrenic command, sent to the edge of what Ambassador Dre called Terran space, to enforce the Council's punitive order. I heard about it secondhand, the way you hear about most military actions that don't involve your own species, filtered through brief mentions in session notes, and the occasional comment in the observer's lounge. 12 ships against a species with no formal fleet registry, no defensive treaties, nothing on record indicating they could put up any kind of resistance at all. It was supposed to be over in a day. That was the word going around the lounge. A show of force, a few destroyed installations, a formal surrender, and then the Caldrenic delegation would come back to council with expanded trade rights, and everyone would move on to the next item of business. I was in the chamber, in my usual seat, halfway through a report on agricultural subsidies, when the alert came through. A single vessel had been detected at the edge of Caldrenic sensor range, unescorted. No weapons signature large enough to register as a threat by any standard the fleet's classification systems used. The Caldrenic commander on station logged it as a scout ship, possibly a diplomatic vessel, and moved his fleet to intercept, because that was standard procedure, and because nobody expected a single unarmed ship to be anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. I was not watching the tactical feed when the intercept began. Almost nobody in the chamber was. It was routine, the kind of military footnote that got mentioned once and then filed away. But the speaker had it pulled up on a side display out of habit, the way he did with most active fleet actions involving council-sanctioned operations, and I happened to glance at it while the agricultural report droned on. The fleet closed to intercept range. The single vessel did not change course, did not power weapons, did not do anything that the fleet's sensors flagged as aggressive. And then, in the space of 4 seconds, all 12 ships went dark. I have already told you what that looked like. I do not think I can describe it any better the second time. One moment there were 12 green markers on a display most of us weren't even watching closely. The next moment there was nothing, and the agricultural report speaker had stopped talking, because he had noticed the room go still around him, and he turned to look at the same display we were all looking at, and none of us said anything for a long time. The speaker called an emergency recess. I do not think that had happened more than twice in my entire tenure on the council. We reconvened an hour later, and by then the tactical situation had changed only in the sense that we now had less information than before, not more. The 12 ships were confirmed destroyed, or at minimum confirmed gone, because the sensor buoys the fleet had deployed on approach showed no debris field, no wreckage signature, nothing consistent with a standard engagement. It was as though the ships had simply ceased to exist. There was no follow-up attack, no further Terran vessels detected anywhere near the border, just silence, the same silence that had swallowed 12 warships in 4 seconds, stretching out across the sensor net like something waiting. And then, 40 minutes into the recess, a single transmission arrived at the border station. Ambassador Dre had it played for the chamber, his voice tighter than I had heard it in the earlier session, all of his earlier confidence gone quiet, somewhere underneath the words he was reading off his display. The transmission was short. It gave a set of coordinates, deep inside what the Caldrenic registry listed as contested territory. It gave a single designation, 5 characters, a name that meant nothing to any of us at the time. USS Halcyon. That was all. No demand, no threat, no explanation for what had happened to 12 ships and the people on board them. Just coordinates and a name, sitting on the display in front of a chamber that had gone from bored to terrified in the space of a single afternoon. I looked over at the side wall, where the archivist sat, and I found Grace Whitlow's chair empty. I did not know yet that she was already back in the deep records vault, pulling up a file that none of us had bothered to read 40 cycles earlier, the one with 3 lines that had seemed like enough at the time. I would read that file myself within the hour, out loud, to a chamber that had never been quieter in all my years on the council, and by the time I finished reading it, I understood exactly why she had tried to stop the vote before it started. I just did not understand, yet, that stopping it would never have mattered. The emergency session that followed the loss of the fleet was unlike any session I had sat through before. Nobody checked their personal displays for unrelated messages. Nobody whispered to their neighbors about matters unrelated to the crisis in front of us. Every delegate in that chamber was looking at the same screen, waiting for someone to explain what had just happened to 12 warships and roughly 4,000 crew. Grace Whitlow returned to the chamber, carrying a data slate, instead of standing empty-handed at the archivist's podium the way she usually did. The speaker, who 40 cycles earlier had denied her request to reconsider a vote in under a minute, now waved her forward without argument. She did not gloat. I want to be clear about that, because I think if I had been in her position, some part of me would have wanted to say I told you so, if only quietly. She did not. She simply activated the display and began to read from the file she had pulled, the one the Council should have read before it ever voted on a war against a species called Terran. I had volunteered to help her present it, mostly because I was the delegate closest to the podium and because someone needed to operate the secondary display while she spoke. I did not expect to end up reading half of it myself, but her voice began to fail partway through, not from fear, I think, but from the strange exhaustion of being right about something terrible for 40 cycles and finally being listened to. So I picked up where she left off, and I read the rest of it to the chamber myself. The species called itself human. Their homeworld, Earth, had been inhabited by their kind for what their own records estimated as several 100,000 years, though their written history only stretched back a fraction of that. What struck me first, reading through the summary the archivists had compiled, was not their technology, which by galactic standards was still considered new. It was their history with each other. Humans had spent the overwhelming majority of their recorded existence in conflict, not with any of us, not with any other species in this chamber, but with themselves. Every landmass on their world had, at some point, hosted wars between different groups of the same species, fighting over land, over belief, over resources, over grievances passed down through so many generations that the people fighting had often forgotten how the conflict began in the first place. Twice in less than a single century, by their own calendar, these conflicts had grown large enough to consume the entire planet at once. Their own historians called these events world wars, and the file noted, almost as an afterthought, that the second of these had ended when one nation used a weapon capable of erasing an entire city in an instant, twice, to force a surrender. I remember stopping there, my hands very still on the podium, and looking out at a chamber of delegates who had gone even quieter than before, if that was possible. They had built that weapon and used it, and afterward, instead of retreating from the knowledge of what they had made, they had spent the rest of their history arguing with each other about whether they had been right to use it, refining it, stockpiling it, teaching it to their children as both a warning and, in some strange way I don't think any of us fully understood, a kind of pride. A species that had split the fundamental building blocks of matter itself to end one war, and then spent 100 more years arguing about the ethics of the thing they had already done, without ever once agreeing to give it up. Grace Whitlow took the podium back at that point, because she said there was a part she needed the chamber to hear in her own voice, and I stepped back and let her. She told us that human history was not a story of steady, peaceful growth, interrupted occasionally by conflict, the way most species in this chamber understood our own pasts. It was closer to the opposite. Conflict was the baseline. Peace was the interruption, the exception, the thing that had to be actively built and defended, and was constantly at risk of collapsing back into war. And yet, somehow, despite that, or perhaps because of it, they had never stopped building. Every war had been followed by an explosion of new invention, new medicine, new industry, as though the species could not tell the difference between preparing to destroy each other and preparing to survive. Their industrial capacity, even by the outdated estimates in the file, which the archivists admitted were likely decades behind current reality, was staggering. Entire regions of their homeworld had, within a single generation, converted almost every factory, every shipyard, every workshop into wartime production, building machines of war faster than any other species in this chamber's recorded history had ever managed, and they had done this more than once, on more than one continent, independently of each other, as though the impulse was simply built into how they organized themselves when threatened. A delegate from the far side of the chamber, a nervous man I did not know well, asked the question I think all of us were thinking. He asked how a species with that history had never made contact with the wider galaxy before now, if they were truly this capable. Grace Whitlow's answer was simple, and it was the part of that afternoon I have never been able to forget. She said humans had spent so much of their history fighting each other that until recently, they had simply never needed to look outward. Their wars had always been close enough to reach on foot, or by ship across their own oceans, or eventually by aircraft across their own skies. There had never been a reason to build weapons meant for the vastness between stars, because every enemy they had ever known lived on the same small world they did. Until now. I looked at the coordinates still displayed on the secondary screen, the ones the human ship had transmitted after erasing 12 Kaldrenic warships in 4 seconds, and I understood, with a kind of cold clarity, that the ship waiting there was not hunting anyone. It had given us its exact location. It was not hiding. It was not retreating to report back to some larger command structure before deciding what to do next. It was waiting to be found. Ambassador Dre stood up from his seat, and for the first time since I had known him, his voice did not carry the easy confidence it usually had. He said this had to be a misunderstanding, that the loss of the fleet must have been some kind of accident, a sensor malfunction, a coincidental system failure that had nothing to do with the single ship his forces had been approaching. He said the Kaldrenic hegemony would not be intimidated by an unproven threat, and that a second fleet, larger than the first, was already being assembled to finish what the Council had authorized. I remember the archivist looking at him then, and I remember the look on her face was not anger, and it was not fear either. It was something closer to pity, the way you might look at someone who was about to walk into traffic, while insisting the vehicle bearing down on them would surely stop in time. She asked him, quietly, whether he had read the same file the rest of us had just heard. He said the file was outdated speculation compiled by frightened archivists, and that the hegemony did not make military decisions based on second-hand records about a species nobody in this chamber had ever actually met. The speaker, to his credit, tried to intervene, suggesting the council table any further fleet action until a formal contact and negotiation attempt could be made, with the humans directly, through proper diplomatic channels, the way first contact was supposed to happen, instead of the way it had already happened. Ambassador Dre refused. He said the hegemony's fleet was already council-sanctioned under the original vote, that no new authorization was required, and that his people did not need permission from a chamber full of delegates who had, in his exact words, gotten frightened by one lucky ambush. I want to tell you that someone stopped him. I want to tell you that the council found some procedural mechanism to halt the second fleet before it launched, the way we had failed to stop the first. We did not. The original vote stood. Ambassador Dre had the legal authority to proceed, and by the time the chamber finished arguing about whether he should, his ships were already moving. I spent the rest of that session in a strange, hollow kind of quiet, watching the tactical display update in small increments, as the second Kaldrenic fleet, nearly 3 times the size of the first, made its way toward the coordinates the human ship had given us. I kept thinking about something small, something that had bothered me since we first read the file. Humans had given us their location, not out of arrogance, I realized, and not out of carelessness. They had given it to us because they wanted to be found, because whatever was waiting for the next fleet that came looking for a fight was not hiding at all. It was set up, it was ready, and it had been ready before the first fleet had even arrived. I did not sleep that night, in the small quarters the council kept for delegates during long sessions. I lay awake running through the numbers, the timeline, trying to make sense of how a species we had only just read about could respond to an unprovoked attack with that kind of precision, that kind of patience, in the space of a single day. It was not until the second fleet actually reached the coordinates that I understood I had been asking the wrong question entirely. The question was never how humans had managed to respond so quickly. The question was what they had already been building, quietly, for however long it had taken them to notice a species called the Kaldrenic hegemony existed at all, and to conclude, correctly, that eventually someone from this chamber would come looking for a war. The second Kaldrenic fleet arrived at the coordinates 31 hours after launch, and for the first 11 minutes, nothing happened at all. I know it was 11 minutes, because I counted every one of them from the observer's gallery, watching the tactical feed alongside the rest of the council, none of us speaking, none of us willing to be the one who broke the silence first. The single human vessel, the one designated USS Halcyon, sat exactly where it had been, unmoving, its systems reading no different than they had during the first encounter. No weapons charge, no shields raised, no maneuvering at all. The Kaldrenic fleet commander, a woman named Priya Keston who had taken over after the first commander's death along with his ship, held her forces at a cautious distance, running every scan her sensors were capable of. I remember hearing, later, that she had requested permission to withdraw and reassess before Ambassador Dre personally overrode her, ordering the fleet to close and engage before the humans had a chance to prepare whatever weapon had destroyed the first fleet. She obeyed. It was not her fault. I want to say that clearly, because I think what happened next has been unfairly laid at her feet by people who were not in that chamber and did not hear the orders being given. The fleet moved to close the distance, and that was when the space around the Halcyon began to change. It did not happen instantly. That is the part that still unsettles me most, even now, even after everything that came after it. It happened gradually, the way a fog rolls in. Except this was not fog. This was ships, dozens of them, then hundreds, sliding into visibility as though they had been there the entire time, and something had simply stopped concealing them. The Halcyon had not been alone. It had never been alone. It had been the tip of something enormous, waiting patiently behind whatever technology kept it hidden from every sensor the Kaldrenic fleet possessed, and now that technology was no longer needed, because the trap had already been sprung the moment the fleet crossed into range. I have tried, many times since, to describe what those ships looked like, and I do not think I have ever done it justice. They were not elegant. They were not built for the kind of aesthetic grace that most species in this chamber, mine included, tend to favor in our own vessel designs. They were built the way a factory is built, blunt and purposeful, hulls scarred with the marks of assembly rather than polished smooth, as though whoever had made them cared far more about how many could be produced in a month than how any single one of them looked doing its job. There were hundreds of them, then more, arriving from what our sensors eventually determined were staggered jump points positioned to reinforce the ambush in waves, as though someone had planned not just for the fleet that came, but for whatever fleet might come after it, and the one after that. Ambassador Dre, watching from a secure feed relayed back to the council chamber, went very quiet. I do not think he said another word for the rest of that encounter, and I do not think anyone in the chamber blamed him for it. What followed was not what I would call a battle. I have read enough military history, some of it involving my own species, to know what a battle looks like: the exchange of fire, the losses on both sides, the slow grinding attrition that eventually produces a winner. This was not that. This was something closer to a demonstration, delivered with a precision that felt, in its own way, more frightening than if it had been chaotic and brutal instead. The human fleet did not simply overwhelm the Kaldrenic ships with numbers, though the numbers alone would likely have been enough. They disabled first. Engine systems, weapons arrays, shield generators, taken out with a targeting accuracy that suggested every strike had been planned before the engagement even began, rather than reacted to in the moment. Ship after Kaldrenic ship went dark, not destroyed, simply stopped, drifting helpless in the space where minutes earlier it had been part of an active battle line. It took less than 9 minutes to render the entire second fleet incapable of fighting. 9 minutes, against a force 3 times the size of the one that had vanished the day before, and by the end of it, the human fleet had lost nothing. Not one ship, not one confirmed casualty on their side, as far as any sensor reading the council later reviewed could determine. There was a surviving officer among the Kaldrenic crews, a man named Piers Calloway, serving aboard one of the disabled ships, who gave testimony to the council some cycles later, once the diplomatic situation had settled enough to allow it. I was present for that testimony, and I remember the way his voice shook when he described what it was like to be boarded by a human recovery team after his ship went dark. He said they were not cruel. That was the word he used, not cruel. And I remember how strange it felt to hear that word applied to a force that had just annihilated a fleet in under 10 minutes. He said the boarding team moved through his ship with the kind of calm efficiency of people who had done this exact procedure many times before, treating wounded crew, securing the vessel, offering no violence beyond what had already been done to stop the ship from fighting. He said one of the human soldiers, a young woman he did not get a name for, had looked at the wreckage of his ship's bridge, at the crew sitting stunned and disarmed around her, and had said something in her own language that the automatic translator on his uniform rendered, imperfectly, as almost an apology, though he was careful to note it had not sounded like regret, so much as simple acknowledgement, the way you might comment on the weather after it had done exactly what everyone expected it to do. He said the phrase that stuck with him most, translated as best the systems could manage, was something close to, that could have gone worse for you. I did not know, listening to his testimony, whether that was meant as reassurance or as a warning. I still do not know. I suspect it might have been both. Back in the council chamber, in the hours immediately after the Second Fleet's defeat, the mood shifted from fear into something closer to a scramble. Delegates who had spent the previous session in stunned silence were suddenly very eager to speak, and almost every one of them wanted to say some version of the same thing, that their own species had never supported the original vote, that they had abstained or voted against it, that they bore no responsibility for what the Caldrenic hegemony had chosen to do. I found this difficult to watch, because I remembered the vote clearly, and I remembered my own hand going up along with nearly everyone else's, and I did not think any amount of retroactive distancing changed what had actually happened in that chamber 40 cycles earlier. But I understood the impulse. Fear does strange things to how people remember their own choices. It was during this scramble that the first direct human transmission arrived at the council itself, rather than at a border station or a fleet commander's console. It came through an open frequency, unencrypted, addressed simply to whatever governing body was responsible for authorizing the attacks against Earth. Someone on the technical staff had to scramble to even figure out how to route it into the chamber's display system, because nothing about the format matched anything the Council's own communication protocols expected. The message was short. It was not read by an ambassador or a translator working from a prepared script, the way most first contact communications in the Council's history had been handled. It was a recording, a single voice, calm and unhurried, speaking in a language the automatic systems translated, with only a small delay. The voice belonged to a woman. Her name, we would later learn, was Captain Nora Fenwick, commanding officer of the USS Halcyon, and the transmission she sent to the entire council chamber consisted of one sentence. Are we done, or does someone else want a turn? I do not think I have ever heard a room go as silent as that chamber went in the seconds after that message finished playing. It was not a threat, not exactly. It did not promise further violence. It simply asked a question, plainly, the way you might ask if anyone else needed the meeting room after you were finished with it, and somehow that plainness was more unsettling than any threat could have been. I looked around the chamber at delegates who, 40 cycles earlier, had barely glanced up from their own private conversations to approve a war against a species they knew nothing about. Now every one of them was looking at a single recorded sentence on the display, trying to decide whether answering it honestly would make things better or worse. Nobody answered that day. The speaker adjourned the session, citing the need for further deliberation, and the chamber emptied out slower than I had ever seen it empty before, delegates lingering near the doors, talking quietly in small clusters, none of them quite ready to go back to their own quarters and be alone with what they had just watched happen. I stayed behind after most of the others had gone, standing near the archivist's podium where Grace Whitlow was quietly gathering her notes. I asked her, because I did not know who else to ask, what she thought would happen next. She said the council had 2 fleets worth of evidence now for what should have been obvious after reading 3 lines in a registry file. She said humans were not going to disappear back into whatever silence they had lived in before the vote, not now, not after this, and that the only real choice left to the chamber was whether it wanted to understand what it was dealing with, or continue pretending, the way it had for 40 cycles, that it did not matter. I asked her what she thought the humans wanted. She looked at me for a long moment before she answered, and I remember her answer clearly, because it was the thing I kept turning over in my mind for the rest of that cycle. She said she did not think they wanted anything from us at all. She said that was, in its own way, the most frightening part. The cycles that followed the Second Fleet's defeat were the strangest of my entire time on the council, because for the first time in my memory, nobody wanted to talk about anything else. Every session opened with updates on the situation at the border, and every session ran long because delegates who had never shown much interest in military affairs suddenly had endless questions about fleet strength, about industrial capacity, about whether the human ships had been reinforcements, or whether that had been, somehow, the entirety of what one system had assembled on short notice. The archivists worked around the clock trying to build a fuller picture of Earth, and what they found only made the chamber more uneasy, not less. Sensor sweeps of the outer edges of human territory, conducted at a respectful distance, because nobody wanted to risk another incident, showed shipyards operating at a pace that did not match any industrial model our own economists understood. Vessels were being completed and launched at intervals that suggested round-the-clock production across multiple facilities simultaneously, not for a single grand fleet meant to overawe an enemy, but as an ordinary, sustained rhythm, the way a factory might produce transport vehicles for civilian use. I remember a briefing where one of the economic delegates, a careful woman who rarely spoke without triple-checking her figures first, tried to explain what this meant in terms the chamber could understand. She said most species represented in the council, including her own, built warships the way you might build a monument, slowly, deliberately, at enormous cost, because war was understood as an exceptional state, a departure from the normal function of a society. She said the data suggested humans did not build that way at all. She said it looked less like a species preparing for war, and more like a species that had simply never fully stopped, that had built an entire civilization around the assumption that conflict might arrive at any time, and had organized its industry accordingly for so long that the habit had outlived any specific enemy it had originally been built to face. Someone in the chamber asked, not unreasonably, why a species with that capability had never expanded outward before now, had never come looking for territory or resources the way most spacefaring civilizations eventually did once they had the means. Grace Whitlow answered that one herself, because by that point, she had effectively become the chamber's unofficial expert on all things human, a role she had never asked for, and clearly found uncomfortable, though she carried it with more patience than I think I would have managed in her position. She said the answer was in the file nobody had wanted to read the first time. Humans had spent so much of their history at war with each other that the idea of expanding outward, of seeking out new frontiers beyond their own solar system, had for most of their existence been a luxury they could not afford, because there was always another conflict at home demanding their attention and their resources first. It was only in the last few generations, by their own calendar, that they had achieved anything resembling stability among themselves, and even that stability, she noted, appeared to be something they maintained actively, rather than something that had simply settled into place on its own. She said this was, in her assessment, the most important thing the Council needed to understand about the species it had gone to war with. Humans were not expanding because they were hungry for territory, or because some ancient grudge had finally boiled over. They were expanding, cautiously and slowly by the standards their own industrial capacity would allow, because they had finally run out of reasons to keep fighting each other, and a species built the way theirs was built did not simply stop building once the fighting stopped. It looked outward instead. And the first thing it had found looking outward was a council that had declared war on it, without bothering to introduce itself first. I asked her, during a quiet moment after that session, whether she thought the Caldrenic hegemony could still salvage the situation through negotiation, whether there was some diplomatic path that avoided further conflict entirely. She said that path had existed 40 cycles ago, before the first vote, and that every choice made since then had narrowed it considerably, though she did not think it was completely closed, not yet. She turned out to be right, though not in the way any of us expected. 9 cycles after the Second Fleet's defeat, a formal delegation arrived at the border station nearest human space, not sent by the Caldrenic hegemony, but by the Council itself, authorized under an emergency measure that passed with far less debate than the original war vote had required. I was part of that delegation, along with Grace Whitlow, a handful of military liaisons, and, somewhat awkwardly, a junior representative from the Caldrenic hegemony, whose presence had been insisted upon by the rest of the Council as a condition of proceeding at all. The negotiations, when they finally happened, were not what I expected. I had imagined, I think, something closer to the tense standoffs I had read about in historical accounts of first contact between hostile species, careful posturing, veiled threats, long silences meant to convey resolve. What we got instead was Captain Nora Fenwick herself, appearing on the view screen of the border station's conference room, in a uniform that looked worn rather than ceremonial, speaking to us with the same unhurried plainness that had characterized her single-sentence transmission cycles earlier. She did not gloat. She did not list demands. She asked, first, whether the council intended to continue the war, and when the answer, delivered carefully by our lead negotiator, was no, she simply nodded and said that was good, because Earth had no particular interest in continuing it either, and had only responded to what had already been done to them. I remember one of the military liaisons asking her, somewhat too bluntly for the room, how many ships Earth had committed to the engagement at the border, curious whether the fleet we had seen represented the full extent of human military capacity or only a fraction of it. She looked at him for a moment before answering, and I remember the answer clearly, because it was delivered without any evident satisfaction, the way you might state a simple fact about the weather. She said it had been one of 11 fleets currently in active service, and that Earth had not needed to recall any additional forces from other assignments to handle the engagement. The room went very quiet after that. I do not think anyone asked a follow-up question for several minutes. What struck me most, watching those negotiations unfold over the following days, was how little Earth seemed to want from any of it. There were no demands for territory, no requests for tribute or reparations, beyond a formal acknowledgement of what had happened, and a commitment that it would not happen again without cause. Captain Fenwick, and later a civilian diplomat who joined the talks, a calm, precise man named Julian Ashworth, both seemed almost uninterested in extracting anything from the situation beyond a basic, functioning peace. I asked Julian Ashworth directly, during a break in one of the longer sessions, why Earth had not pressed its advantage further, given how thoroughly it had demonstrated its capability. I expected some careful diplomatic answer, the kind that avoided the real substance of the question, the way most council diplomats had trained themselves to do. Instead, he told me, simply, that Earth had spent most of its history learning the hard way what happened when the winners of a war used their victory to humiliate the losers, rather than to build something stable. He said his people had made that mistake more than once, and had eventually learned that a peace built on humiliation rarely stayed a peace for long, whereas a peace built on clear boundaries and honest consequences tended to hold. He said Earth was not interested in ruling anyone. He said Earth was interested in being left alone, and in making sure that anyone who decided not to leave them alone understood, clearly and permanently, exactly what that decision would cost them. I thought about the archivist's words then, about how she had said the most frightening part of all this was that humans did not seem to want anything from us. I understood, finally, what she had meant. A species that wanted territory or resources could be negotiated with, because there was something concrete to offer in exchange for peace. A species that only wanted to be left alone, and had demonstrated it was fully capable of enforcing that boundary without any real cost to itself, left very little room for negotiation at all. There was nothing to offer them that they wanted, except the one thing entirely within our control to simply stop doing. The formal terms, when they were finally agreed upon after nearly 3 cycles of talks, were almost anticlimactic in their simplicity. The Kaldrenic hegemony would issue a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, would withdraw all remaining forces from what Earth considered its territory, and would pay reparations calculated not by Earth's own demands, which Julian Ashworth insisted they had never intended to make excessive, but by an independent council assessment of the material cost of the 2 lost fleets. In exchange, Earth agreed to no further action, and, notably, to formal diplomatic recognition of the Council as an institution, though not, Captain Fenwick was careful to clarify, recognition of the specific vote that had authorized the war against them in the first place. She said Earth understood the difference between an institution and the choices made within it, and that the distinction mattered to how they intended to move forward. I left that final negotiating session with a feeling I had not expected to carry away from any of this. It was not relief, exactly, though there was some of that. It was closer to a kind of quiet, uncomfortable respect, the sort you feel for something that has proven itself capable of enormous harm and has chosen, for reasons entirely its own, not to use that capability beyond what was strictly necessary. I did not know, returning to the council chamber for what would become one of the most consequential sessions in its recorded history, that the hardest part of this entire ordeal was still waiting for us. It was not going to come from Earth. It was going to come from what the rest of the council still had to say to each other, and to themselves, about the choice that had started all of it. The session convened to formally close the matter drew every delegate the council chamber could seat, and several more who had to stand along the back wall, because there were not enough chairs. I had never seen the chamber that full, not for trade disputes, not for territorial arbitration, not for any of the matters that usually filled our calendar. Word had spread, the way it always does, and everyone wanted to be present for what was about to happen. Ambassador Callum Dre stood at the same podium where he had once requested a routine punitive action against a species he had called vermin, and this time he did not stand with the same confidence. His voice was steady. I will give him that much credit, but it carried none of the easy dismissiveness it had carried 40 cycles earlier. He read a formal statement acknowledging the hegemony's actions, accepting the terms negotiated with Earth, and offering what he called a full and unreserved apology to the chamber for the consequences his request had brought upon every species represented within it. Nobody applauded when he finished. Nobody offered him any words of reassurance either. He simply stepped down from the podium and returned to his seat, and the silence that followed him was, I think, its own kind of judgment, more effective than anything the chamber could have said aloud. It was the speaker who finally broke that silence, and I remember his words exactly, because I have thought about them many times since. He looked at Ambassador Dre, across the full width of the chamber, and he asked the question that had been sitting underneath every session for the past several cycles, the question none of us had quite been willing to say plainly until that moment. You actually declared war on Earth. He did not say it as an accusation, not exactly. It came out more as disbelief, the kind of disbelief you feel when something you already know to be true still seems impossible to fully accept. Each word drawn out slightly longer than it needed to be, as though saying it slowly might somehow make it easier to understand how it had happened at all. Ambassador Dre did not answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was quiet enough that the chamber's audio systems had to work to carry it to the back rows. He said yes. He said the hegemony had looked at 3 lines in a registry file and had decided that was enough information to authorize a war, because it had never occurred to anyone that a species with no formal council standing could possibly represent a threat worth taking seriously. He said he understood now how wrong that assumption had been, and that he did not expect the chamber's forgiveness, only its acknowledgement that the mistake had been made honestly, out of ignorance rather than malice. I do not know whether that distinction matters much to the people who died on those 2 fleets, or to their families back on whatever worlds they called home. I have thought about that a great deal since, and I still do not have a satisfying answer. Grace Whitlow rose from her seat near the archivist's podium, and the chamber quieted further to let her speak, a courtesy that would have been unthinkable for an archivist 40 cycles earlier, when her voice alone had not been enough to delay a vote by even a single session. She did not address Ambassador Dre directly. Instead, she turned to the full chamber and proposed a formal motion, the kind of procedural request that usually generated hours of debate over precise wording and jurisdictional implications. This time, the motion was simple. She asked that the council formally reclassify Earth status in the official registry, from unaffiliated and unassessed, to a designation the council had used only a handful of times in its entire recorded history, reserved for species whose capabilities were considered significant enough to require mandatory review before any council body could authorize military action against them. The vote that followed was unanimous. I want to make sure that detail is understood clearly, because in all my cycles serving on this council, I had never once seen a vote pass without at least a handful of dissenting or abstaining votes. On matters far less consequential than this one, every hand in that chamber went up together, including Ambassador Dre's own, and I do not think there was a single delegate present who needed convincing. The session closed, not long after that, without the usual procedural announcements about the next scheduled meeting, without the ordinary business that typically filled the final minutes of any council gathering. Delegates filed out slowly, in small, quiet clusters, much the way they had after the first emergency session following the loss of the initial fleet, except this time the quiet felt less like fear, and more like the particular exhaustion that comes after finally understanding something you should have understood much earlier. I stayed behind in the chamber after almost everyone else had gone, the way I sometimes did when I needed a few quiet minutes before returning to my own quarters. Grace Whitlow was still there too, gathering her notes at the archivist's podium, moving slower than usual, the way people move when a long wait has finally been set down. I asked her whether she thought this was truly over, whether the council had learned whatever lesson it was supposed to learn from all of this, or whether, given enough cycles and enough new delegates who had not personally sat through what we had just sat through, some future chamber might make the same mistake again with some other species nobody had bothered to properly read about first. She considered the question for a long moment before she answered, and I remember thinking, watching her, that she looked tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. She said she did not know. She said institutions had short memories, even when the people who built them tried very hard to give them longer ones, and that the only real insurance against making the same mistake twice was making sure the lesson got written down clearly enough, and painfully enough, that it was hard to ignore even generations later. I pulled up Earth's registry file myself before I left the chamber that evening, alone at my own console, the same file that had once been 3 sparse lines and was now a document dense enough to take a full session to properly summarize. I read through it slowly, all of it this time, not skimming the way I had the first time I had glanced at it, out of idle curiosity during a routine vote. I understood, reading it properly for the first time, why Grace Whitlow had never bothered arguing her case loudly 40 cycles earlier, why she had simply asked for the vote to be reconsidered, and then walked away quietly when that request was denied. Arguing had never been the part that would have saved anyone. The file itself was the argument, complete and self-contained, and all it had ever needed from us was the willingness to actually read it before deciding we already understood what we were dealing with. I do not know what the next species the Council encounters will look like, or what 3 sparse lines might one day sit in some registry file waiting to be dismissed too quickly by a chamber that has forgotten, or never learned, what happened here. I only know that every delegate who sat through those sessions now checks the footnotes before they vote, and that somewhere in the depths of the Council's archives, alongside every other file it has ever kept, there now sits a far longer entry under the word Earth, the first line of which reads, "In Grace Whitlow's own careful hand," before anything else is written. Read this file completely before you decide it does not matter. I have never forgotten it. I do not think any of us who were in that chamber ever will.